Jake is a workforce economist for the Oregon Employment Department, specializing in the labor market in the Portland area. He provides data analysis and economic advice to local businesses, business associations, and government agencies to facilitate intelligent decision-making. Originally from Los Angeles, Jake has a degree in economics and politics from the Harvard of the West, Willamette University. I'd like to introduce Jake.
All right. Hi. Hello. As previously mentioned, my name is Jake. I am an economist with the Oregon Employment Department, specifically focusing, specifically assigned to Multnomah County, but I like to talk about, or I'm also talk about Portland area in general. So today, talking about the labor market and the economy, talking very broadly about what's going on with jobs and unemployment, and then talking more specifically about the labor market in Oregon and the Portland metro area, and then talking about a little bit about future prospects for the region. All right, so let's go ahead. So first, just want to start with ask if you're ever asked to do a survey for the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the U.S. Census Bureau or the Oregon Employment Department, either in personal or professional capacity. We ask that you fill it out because all of the data that I'm about to show you, or nearly all the data I'm about to show you, comes from these surveys. So the higher response rate we have, the more quality the data is. All right. So if you've been hearing news about the Portland and economy lately, you've probably heard it's pretty gloomy. Earlier this year, there were some large, notable layoffs in Portland, in big name brand Portland businesses such as Nike, Columbia, UPS, and others. And other families are feeling the pinch from rising prices and high inflation. And so it's these very public layoffs and sticker shock, if you will, have led to a kind of culture of a little bit of gloom about the local economy and maybe some unsavory news about the area. And so this is all fair. Like raising price, increased inflation and raising grocery prices is not good for anybody. And layoffs and people losing jobs is not good either. But despite these high-profile economic news, the economy as a whole is doing pretty well. And we can see this in consumer spending. So this is a graph of real personal consumption expenditures. Is that me? Oh, never mind. This is a graph of real personal consumer expenditures over time in the U.S., which is adjusted for inflation, and you can see that as of late, people are spending more money. So consumption expenditures is basically the amount of money people are spending on a number of things, whether it be groceries or goods or housing or whatever. When there is economic downturn, real personal consumer expenditure tends to go down. So you can see in the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, or 2007 through 2010, real consumer expenditures went down. And likewise, during 2020, real consumer expenditure tanked. And even though people are feeling gloomy about the economy, real personal consumer expenditures continue to go up. So even though people may not be feeling good, and again, for good reason, prices are rising, and there have been some notable layoffs across Portland, people are still spending money. And in the economy, that's kind of the most important thing. So even if they're not feeling great, they're still spending money. One fun fact, for instance, is that over the summer, I don't know how to say this exactly, but it was the most domestic flight travels ever in the U.S., for instance. All right, so that's kind of nationally. Looking specifically at Portland, The Portland metro area. So, a quick definition: the Portland Metropolitan Statistical Area is a 7-county region encompassing Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, Yamhill, and Columbia counties in the state of Oregon, and Clark and Skamania counties in the state of Washington. So, a pretty broad area that encompasses the metro area. And so this graph shows the job changes relative, it compares the COVID-19 job changes compared to the Great Recession job changes since the start of the recession. So you can see that red line is the job change relative to pre-recession employment level. So you can see it's dropped, but now 55 months later, in August 2024, the Portland metro area is 0.4% above pre-recession employment levels. Compared to the Great Recession, which started in December 2007, 55 months out, the Portland metro region was still almost 3% below pre-recession employment levels. Now, there's a lot of differences between these two recessions, but the point is that even though growth might be sluggish as of late, taking a little bit more of a long-term view, Portland and Oregon and the U.S. recovered very, very quickly, especially when compared to other recessions. So it's important to keep in mind where we were. Looking at a little bit differently, this is a graph showing year-over-year employment change, again, in the Portland metro region. And you can see, as of late, that even though we had super strong job growth in 2021, it has slowly slowed down and stagnated in the early part of this year, but it's picking back up. You can see that even though it's slowing down and maybe near zero year-over-year job change, we're not facing long periods of job loss like there was in 2007 or in 2020. So breaking down this year-over-year job growth a little bit deeper, much of the Portland employment change has come from private education and health services, mostly health services, healthcare places like hospitals or long-term care facilities, short-term care facilities have been growing pretty strongly. So this shows year-over-year job growth by industry. It's ordered and the bar length is determined by percentage employment change, but I also put the job change level there as well. And you can see that private health and education, as I mentioned earlier, is growing pretty fast, as well as government and manufacturing, while leisure and hospitality, transportation utilities, which is kind of like Amazon, and professional and business services, which tend to be legal and other services, have not been growing so quickly year over year. I don't have this, but I don't have a change since 2019, but an important, just a small note, is that the leisure and hospitality sector still hasn't recovered to pre-recession levels. Looking at the unemployment rate, so this is the unemployment rate comparing the Portland metro region to the United States. And there's not too much interesting going on here, but you can see that for the last couple years, unemployment has remained quite low in the region and nationwide, and in the state, and pretty much everywhere. This is all to say that even though there is doom and gloom, and again, really, this is all aggregate data. So it's not necessarily accounting for any one person's situation or any one industry situation. This is just kind of on the whole. On the whole, we see personal consumption expenditure keep going up. We see job growth recovered from the pandemic recession and continuing to not lose jobs. And we're also seeing a continued low unemployment rate. For context, the 10-year unemployment rate average in the Portland metro region is 5%. So we've been below the long-term average for quite a while now. All right, so that's the first part over. The second part I find a little bit more interesting, talking about the labor market. So labor market is labor demand, so businesses hiring, and the availability of labor, so people looking for work. The big kind of theme here is, in the short term, the labor market is loosening, but in the long term, we will continue to see the local labor market remain historically tight. So the first graph, it's a little hairy, but I believe we can figure it out. So this shows the different components of labor demand and labor availability in the Portland metro. So this yellow bar, this is the number of job vacancies in the Portland Tri-County area, Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas County. This dark blue bar is the number of unemployed people in the Portland Tri-County area, and then this green trend line is the ratio of number of unemployed people per job vacancy. As you can see, in 2021 and 2022, the ratio of unemployed people per job vacancy dropped below 1, which is very tight. This ostensibly what this means is that there's fewer than one person looking for work for every job vacancy. And I'm sure you heard it, it was very difficult for businesses to hire. There's a lot of job movers. Layoffs went down because businesses knew how hard it was to find more employees. Now, the main reason why this ratio drops so low is due to a significant increase in job demand. So 2019 and previously, job demand hovered around, there was about 20,000 job vacancies at any point in time in the Portland Tri-County area. And in 2021 and 2022, that number hovered around 40,000. So the number of job vacancies at any given time doubled pretty much, even though the number of unemployed people was about the same. Lately, we've seen job demand go down in the form of job vacancies. We've seen that number go down from about 30,000 to sitting around between 20 and 30,000 at any given time. This is still historically pretty tight. Having this ratio below 2 is still, in the context of the history of the US, it's still pretty tight. But we're not at the point where we were in 2021 when job demand just outstripped the number of workers available. Yeah. Okay. So a quick note about this graph, as you can see, it's only updated as of March of 2024, so it's a little bit behind. Looking more recently, this is national data. So this is national JOLTS data. This is going to show hires, quits, and separations. We can see evidence of the labor market loosening here in national data, which largely holds true for statewide and local, although it's going to be a little bit different. And we can see that the number of the labor demand that I was mentioning earlier, we see it continue to trend down nationwide, below the average, below the hiring rate average from 2000 to 2019. So that just labor demand is more or less going down. And as a result, we're seeing the Great Resignation, as it was termed. We're also seeing this go away as well. The quits rate was, again, you can see, very high in 2021 and 2022, but has precipitously dropped down since then, at least nationally. One other interesting thing, though, is that layoffs remain low. So again, layoffs were pretty low during 2021 and 2022 because it was so difficult to hire. But now we're seeing the labor market loosening. We see employers, again, nationally and generally, still a little bit reticent to lay off or discharge employees. So it remains pretty tight. Again, we're still seeing it loosening in the short term. We're seeing job demand go down. We're seeing fewer people quit. But it remains sort of tight in the short term. Now, in the long term, we're going to see continued tightness. And a big reason for this is that 23% of the workforce is 55 or older. So this is the workforce in the 5 Portland metropolitan, the 5 Oregon counties in the Portland metropolitan statistical area, which is the same as the Portland metro area. 23% of the workforce is 55 or older, or in other words, 23% of the workforce is expected to retire in the next 10 years. That's a lot of people. That's a large chunk of the workforce. Now, this wouldn't be as big of a deal if there was more young people in the workforce, or if there was just more young people in the population. But there aren't really enough young people locally to replace the outgoing workforce. So this is the number of people in the Tri-County, this is a Portland Tri-County population by age. So this bar indicates the number of 10-year-olds, the number of 25-year-olds, the number of 4-year-olds, and so on. And you can see that there's a big spike in this millennial generation, but the number of folks by age goes down as you get into Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And as these people leave, there aren't really enough people to replace them, at least naturally. Now, this has actually been a trend for a long time in Oregon and the US. We've seen the natural population increase, so births, minus deaths. We've seen that decline rapidly over, over time. But usually that hasn't been an issue because Oregon and Portland have seen net in-migration. From 2010 to 2019, Portland and Oregon was one of the fastest growing states and metro regions in the nation, but that, as of late, has plummeted. Plummeted is a little strong. That, as of late, has gone down. As you can see in 2022 and also in 2023, we have seen net domestic migration decrease and more at least stagnate. So normally the workforce is supplemented by immigration, but Oregon and Portland is currently seeing net stagnation or net out-migration. So those job openings that were normally filled by people moving into the area from other parts of the US are no longer there. There's a couple ways to break this down. You can do it by income, which you can see here. I've done it here by age. This is just Multnomah County, so this is just Portland. I can only really do single counties for this kind of analysis because it gets kind of hairy. You start adding multiple counties and get a census database. But you can see that for largely this represents the city of Portland. It tracks a lot of folks aged 18 to 34. So 18 to 24, that's people, largely people going to like PSU or other colleges in the area, Lewis and Clark, University of Portland, what have you. And we're seeing notable net out migration from children and folks 45 to 54, which suggests out migration of families from the Portland city center. Now, where they're going, usually most of it is going to Vancouver in Washington, but we're also seeing it go kind of having a little bit of a donutting effect where people are leaving the city center and going into areas around it, Beaverton, Lake Oswego, what have you. So this is just by age from 2022 to 2023. Now, there are lots of reasons why people would move out. Moving is a personal decision with many factors, but one factor I want to focus on today is just the bad housing market for buyers. So this is the median sales price and inventory in the Portland metro region. And you can see, as you've heard and probably you've experienced, or you know people who have experienced, people trying to buy houses, housing prices increased. Listing, or at least this is listing price, so listing price in the past 2 years has increased, in the past 3 years has increased 17% from around, and this is from just 2021, from around 500,000 to 600,000 for your median house. And when you look at the number of active listings, it kind of makes sense. The number of available, the number of active listings halved from 2019 to 2021. So there's about 7,500 active listings available in 2019, and because people, I think I have it on the next slide, but because people started buying houses and there's a very hot housing market, that declined to around 3,000. Now we're starting to see active listings crawl back, but it is still, there's still a significantly lower supply than there was pre-2020. A big reason for, as you can see, there's you see this huge decline in the number of active listings, and a big reason is because housing formation outpaced unit permitting in 3 of the last 4 years in Portland MSA. So on this chart, these dark blue bars show the change in the number of households. So the increase is that there are now, in 2021, there are 22,000 more households in the Portland MSA than there were in 2020. So this is people forming households, if that makes sense. And then this green trend line is the number of housing permits approved. So one thing I hear a lot is that, people want to stop, residents of the Portland metro region want to stop people from moving to the region, making housing more expensive. It's a thread I hear a lot. But actually what we saw during 2020 and 2021 was a significant increase in the number of, in the household formation rate. This was people, mostly millennials, who were living with roommates who did not want to live with roommates. So they moved out and bought their own home or rented their own apartment, or people that moved out of their parents' basement is the stereotypical example. Basically, it's people who were living with others. And during 2020, we saw a huge increase, it was only an increase about like 0.5% or something, but with the number of people living there, it's actually a huge increase in terms of absolute value. But with this increase, just people didn't want to live with others, basically, during 2020 and 2021. And so that, just going back to this graph real quick, significantly decreased the housing supply and thus increased the average listing price in the Portland metro region. All to say, this is, of all the factors of why people leave or move to an area, housing price is a big reason, and it went up. Yeah, it went up because of an increase in housing formation. Okay, so my last portion, I'm just going to talk briefly. I don't know how much time I have left. Talk briefly about Portland and Oregon projections, what we project for the next 10 years from 2022 to 2032. So over the next decade, from 2022, we expect there to be increase in total employment of 127,000 new jobs in the Portland Tri-County area. Again, this graph is organized by percent new job growth, and then the absolute level of projected job growth is labeled on each of them. So information sector is projected to be the fastest growing sector by percentage. Makes sense, software and chips manufacturing tend to be, have been historically growing pretty fast, and we anticipate it to continue still job growth over time. By absolute level, we see private education and health services is the fastest growing over the next 10 years. Now, a big reason for that is mainly health services, and it actually ties back to the aging of the population I talked about earlier. As we see the Portland and Oregon population age, there's going to be more need for long-term care facilities, and so more nurses and more healthcare providers are going to be needed over the next decade. So that tends to be more health services rather than private education. And finally, last note is leisure and hospitality. So leisure and hospitality, I don't know if it's the only sector, but it's one of the only sectors that has still has yet to recover back to pre-2020 employment levels. So a large chunk of that growth, of that 18,000 job growth over the next 10 years, is just the leisure and hospitality and service jobs getting back to where they were in 2019. Not necessarily that it's going to grow really fast for some reason. It's just still has not yet recovered. And that's largely the same in a lot of West Coast cities. Seattle too has also yet to see its leisure and hospitality sector return to pre-2020 levels. So these 10-year projections more or less bank on the assumption that Oregon is going to return to some level of net immigration over the next decade, maybe 4% population growth by immigration over the next 10 years. But that might not necessarily happen. So the Oregon population baseline forecast is this dark blue line, and again, it's projected to continue increasing 4% over the next 10 years because it's expected to, what I mentioned earlier, is expected to return to, the net immigration is expected to return positive. But there is a chance that there is a zero migration scenario where we see current trends continue for the next 10 years. And current trends of being fewer people, we see stagnation in net migration. So again, this pretty strong, decently strong increase over the next 10 years is predicated on the fact that we expect population growth to continue, but there's a chance that it might not. And if it doesn't, then we're going to have to, or businesses in Oregon are going to have to figure out ways to increase labor force participation or replace workers in one way or another. So that might look like, as many of you have probably seen in a lot of fast food establishments or other restaurants, instead of having a server or cashier, you're ordering on an app or you're ordering on a screen. Or it might mean for other businesses that they have to look at populations that have historically have lower labor force participation rate. One instance would be folks who are formerly incarcerated. They have one of the lowest labor force participation rates in all populations, so businesses may have to start hiring from those types of populations, which they haven't in the past. I'll answer your question in a second, but that is my last slide. Thank you for listening. Hope you learned something. And I'm happy to take questions for the next however long you have questions.
My question is about remote work. And
Yeah.
on that job vacancy slide you had, and then also the second to the last slide, where you're projecting job growth.
Mhm.
Where do the jobs show up where I work from home, but I'm working for a company in Colorado?
Mm-hmm.
Where is that showing up as a Portland job or another area job, or is that?
So that would show up if you're working, if you say Colorado, that would show up. It would show up as an out-of-state job. So it would not, if you were working in, or if you were living in state or working out of state, you would not show up in these numbers.
So these are physical positions.
Yeah, businesses with an Oregon address. Yes.
Excuse me for interrupting, but it might be best for our videographer if we can share the mic. So,
Thank you.
Jake, full-time versus part-time.
Yeah.
When, some guy has 3 jobs, how does it reflect in the database?
Yeah.
And the other thing is participation rate. Are these numbers, are they adjusted for participation rates?
Yeah. Okay. So if someone has 3 jobs, it shows up as 3 jobs here. So I think that's your first question. But it will, if we're looking at unemployment rate, it will only show up as 1 job here. Yeah. And then the second part of your question was?
Well, just participation rate that we hear about a lot of people. I'm from the generation where you stay at a job for a long time.
Yeah.
I've had my job for 48 years. I guess that's not what younger people are doing.
So that's actually a good question. I had this spare graph in that I cut from my presentation because it can be a bit hairy. But that was zero migration alternative scenario assumes labor force participation rate remains the same in especially among historical trends. So this blue line assuming population increase is expecting labor force participation rate to stay the same, and same for that gold one. If it's expecting labor force participation rate to remain the same with population decline. There is a zero migration latent labor force line, and it's a slightly lighter blue dotted line. And so that is a zero. So that scenario is termed the zero migration latent labor force scenario. So it's kind of what I mentioned a little bit earlier. So that assumes zero net in-migration over the next 10 years. However, it is equalizing certain parts of labor force participation rate. So that is one way to combat a zero migration alternative scenario. Is for instance, the labor force participation rate for women is lower than it is for men. So if you make that equal, you can add more people to the labor force without adding to your population, and among other things.
That's where I thought you were going, because if we don't have enough in-migration and natural births,
Yeah.
maybe, folks that are older will continue to stay in the labor force rather than retire.
Yeah.
Okay, you're seeing it that's in the data for Oregon?
Not yet, but it's possible. It generally, historically, I don't. Whether people are working later in life, I don't know if there's any necessarily conclusive evidence whether people are retiring early or retiring later. But over the long term, we've seen people work longer, mostly due to like the physical exertion at work. So working a desk job is not as tiresome as working in a field or at a manufacturing plant. So in general, we've seen people work later in life. Historically, over a long term.
If you've outlived your resources, go back to work.
Yeah, that's one way.
Other questions? Come on.
Jake, you had a slide earlier about the spending, and you had consumer and government spending more toward the top. I know that there's a lot of debt piling up out there, both at the personal level, consumer level, as well as the especially federal government level. You all heard about the austerity programs that, let's say, Greece had to go through last decade. What factors do you see in the future, not necessarily just for the Portland area, but for the country, that would need to happen, that may possibly we'd have to go through an austerity program here in the United States, where things would need to be cut back on both government programs and, for that matter, consumer spending?
Federally, I'm not worried. That's a whole thing. I'm not going to touch that. But federally, I'm not worried about austerity in terms of budget deficit or what have you, whatever. Locally, I would be a little bit worried in Portland and Oregon. So one of the other issues with a population decline is that you have fewer taxpayers. And I don't know. Oh, actually, yeah. So in places, so this is the same scenario with baseline forecast, zero migration forecast for personal income. And this is important for like the Oregon state legislature budget. So if we continue to see this decline in the number of people, there's fewer people paying taxes, there's less money to go around for government programs, for taking care of the streets and all that. It's definitely a concern of you'll see over the next 10 years that if zero migration comes to fruition, that the amount of money available, again, for just like taking care of roads, is going to decline. So that is a real concern for the state and for the city and for cities all around. What the knock-on effects of that, I'm not totally sure, but it would lead to just lower standard of care for just saying streets, but for a local infrastructure.
My question is about productivity per worker. You know, we're seeing a big revolution, hasn't quite hit us yet, but let's say artificial intelligence does everything. We don't have self-driving cars yet, but we're supposed to have it by now. But if we have artificial intelligence replacing jobs, but workers are more productive because they can use AI as tools to do the same work they did for a fraction of the time they spent before. Is that productivity per worker in any of these, or is it just the number of jobs and the income generated by the current number of jobs? Are we doing any future casting, I guess?
So the productivity per worker would be included in something like gross domestic product or GDP, which is not included on any of the things I have. I don't even think I have a spare slide for that.
Can you hand the mic back to him?
Okay.
Or you have to speak in.
I don't know if this is
Is that
on.
on?
I'll try to speak louder. What was your question?
The question was about the effect of productivity per worker.
Yeah.
In all these revenue. Projections.
Yeah. Again, nationally, I'm not entirely certain. It's a little.
Continue.
It's a little hairy. There's a couple of things. So again, what I mentioned with technology, it's not because there's a lot of job demand and we're not really seeing population growth. I anticipate technology doing jobs, but I don't necessarily anticipate they're taking jobs because a lot of the jobs that technology's already taken, such as cashiers or service staff, are jobs that weren't really being filled as of late. Regarding this productivity, something that's interesting in Oregon is that we've seen stronger per capita income, which loosely suggests that workers in Oregon tend to be more productive, or the people who remain in Oregon who are working tend to be more productive. And that is one way for Oregon to increase income, or is to become more productive using technology and stuff. Nationally, I'm not necessarily sure what that looks like, but in Oregon, we're seeing a little bit of workers being more productive for one reason.
On the inward migration, what impact does tax policy have on having these businesses locate here? And before you have employees, you need employers. What impact does tax policy, or is there some metric we can see on, this tax policy would actually lower inward migration and lower the available labor workforce?
I'm sure someone has that. I don't really, unfortunately. I can't really speak too much to the effect of tax policy on the impact of migration or like net business movement. What I can say is that using loose USPS data, so U.S. Postal Service data, we can see business address changing and do a loose net business address changing to certain zip codes and away from certain zip codes. And we definitely have seen businesses move out of, especially downtown Portland. Now, a lot of the more notable ones that I'm aware of, I can't speak for if this is a broader trend, but anecdotally, we are seeing a lot of businesses just move out of Portland to Lake Oswego or Beaverton or what have you. So they're just moving out of the city, not necessarily the state. And the reason that kind of comes to me and seems to me is just no longer a premium. So previously, 2019 and before, there was a premium for having your business downtown. it was centrally located. There's, a lot of public transit oriented towards there. There's a lot of office space, but it's not necessarily where people live. And so what's a premium now is having either like remote work or your office closer to where you live or other reasons. So there's more of a premium on other things rather than having your business be centrally located. Hopefully that answers part of your question.
A question. Historically, what has been the impact of the presidential election on the Northwest economy? Yep, whipped it out.
Historically, not futuristic.
Moving on.
I mean, generally, local economic trends are long term. They're long term. So any short term change, though it might affect the stock market or whatever, general change that we've seen, the increase, for instance, the increase in housing prices, that is something that has been built up over time. It's not necessarily because something happened in one presidency or another. That's just been kind of a long-term lack of housing production. So the economic trends tend to be more long-term and structural. They are impacted by policy. But yeah,
No more unfair questions? Anyone else? I want to thank Jake very much.
Okay.
Thank you.